Good afternoon. I am Vicki Brooke. I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University. We are CETL's partner in the KTER Research Center, and I'll serve as your facilitator for our session today. This session is going to focus on the target audience of consumers, or the primary stakeholders, and we're going to look at how to translate research for the target audience of people with disabilities. Before we get started, let me just kind of briefly go over the flow of what the next couple hours are going to look like. We're going to begin with Dr. James Krause from the Medical University of South Carolina. After his presentation, we're going to take a short kind of stretch break, a little 10-minute break. When you return, we'll have Dr. Fred Schroeder, the Executive Director of the National Rehabilitation Association. Dr. Schroeder will be followed by Dr. Catherine Inge from Virginia Commonwealth University. Then we're going to have a Q&A period where participants are encouraged to ask questions via the conference chat pod that's on the left-hand side of your screen. And I would encourage everybody, as our speakers are presenting their information and you kind of think of a question, I'll be watching the chat pod and I'll write down your questions. So please feel free to post questions just at any time that you're thinking of them. Before I turn the program over to Dr. Krause, I'd like to go over 3 questions that were used in framing today's session that kind of put us in the knowledge translation mindset. The first question was, what are some strategies for including stakeholders, people with disabilities, in rehabilitation research? How to maximize research relevance in order to enhance knowledge translation among stakeholders? And what are some strategies for making research findings more accessible? So our presenters were looking at those three questions, and their presentation will address all 3 of those. So with those questions in mind, let's begin with Dr. James Krause. Dr. Krause is the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Human Professions at the Medical University of South Carolina. He also serves as the Science Director of South Carolina Spinal Cord Injury Research Fund and the Director of the Center for Rehabilitation Research in Neurological Conditions, as well as the Director of Longevity After Injury Project. I guess Dr. Krause has no free time. He is well recognized for his research in the area of spinal cord injury and is particularly well known for his research documenting vocational rehabilitation outcomes for individuals with SCI, as well as researching quality of life. His interest in research has its roots in his own spinal cord injury, which occurred in 1971. Dr. Krause?
Thank you very much. The topic of my talk today is Beyond 90 Days, Successful Employment After Disability. And you might notice the 90-day is really a key facet within our field, because that is the 90-day case closure used by VR typically, where an individual is deemed to have a successful outcome if they have been working for 90 consecutive days. Our approach is to look at successful employment, and we define it much more broadly, which I will get into, and we use a systematic approach to investigating employment outcomes, and we do that throughout the life cycle. We, of course, want to acknowledge our funding agents, and it really is the National Institute for Disability and Rehab Research, and we are very fortunate to be funded through 2 mechanisms, and one is allowing us to apply the Successful Employment and Quality Work-Life Framework to severe disability due to SCI, and the other is to apply the framework and do that to multiple sclerosis, and to allow us to draw some comparisons with SCI throughout our work. So my purpose today, what I'm going to really focus on, is again our research program that's entitled Beyond 90 Days, Successful Employment After Disability. And so I'm going to cover the philosophy of the program as we move forward, and what really drives us with this program. I'm going to present an overview and some examples of our work already concluded. And so even though we are really just gearing up a lot of the work within the current funding mechanisms, we've done work over the years that have looked at successful employment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as examples of the type of research that we're moving into. And then lastly, I'm going to describe the two studies that are currently funded, in progress, really just underway, and one is on SCI, one is on MS. And the common thread is that they both use the successful employment framework, which really is defined by looking at a much wider array, wider scope of outcomes that are really more parallel with the general population, and really, honestly, all the things that go into career throughout someone's lifetime, and not are just around the transition of the time where they either start work or they return to work in the case of a traumatic disability. Next. So just as a background, employment it's of great importance to adult life. It's very fundamental to adult life, and really the same applies to people with disabling conditions. And once you think about employment being fundamental to adult life, and really saying that ultimately there's no difference between the goals of someone in the general population from what someone might expect after disability, then it's easy to look at the framework that we use. So when we look at employment, it brings many tangible benefits to it. There's income, health insurance, many things that the average person gets from employment. And sometimes these things are a little bit maybe de-emphasized when someone has a disability. And I don't mean by the person with a disability, but we do see a lot in our field studies on the importance of avocational productive activities, and those activities like volunteerism and education for the sake of learning. Those things are very important, but they don't bring the tangible benefits that we all get from our jobs that are very essential to our work. And then there are the intangible benefits that relate to psychological adaptation, purpose in life, and what we find with people with cord injury is that they need, as really with a lot of severe disability, or probably really again true to everyone's life, is that people need something to drive them. And for some people it may be family, it may be spirituality, but for some people it's clearly is work. And without a doubt, the onset of a disabling condition does present significant challenges to either maintaining employment if the individual has the opportunity to continue employment after a traumatic disability or adult onset disability, or to obtaining new employment. If you hear pauses intermittently, I'm just getting a little drink of water as we go. So the federal and state governments have taken leadership roles in promoting outcomes after the onset of a disabling condition, or among youth with disabilities who are transitioning to adulthood, where employment is a key issue. And the nature of that support may include retraining, various levels of education. Now, we know from our research that really education is the single most important factor to the employment of people with disabling conditions, certainly with our group with spinal cord injury. And what we find with spinal cord injury is if you look at the employment rates as a function of education, they're very low across severity of condition. But if you look at the people who are in the least severe injury categories, people that maintain their ability to walk or have very incomplete injuries, which means they have a lot of recovery, employment is a little less important. You go from the lowest educational levels, and as you move forward to completion of a high school certificate, to some training beyond to a college degree, very much of a decreasing function, where, in other words, you see people, the employment rates go up rather quickly with additional education, and then it tends to plateau with higher education. And you see just the opposite with people who have very much more severe SCI. So you don't see much of an impact of a little education, but as you get into those highest levels of education, 4-year degree and beyond, those outcomes become almost equivalent. So I always view education as the great equalizer, and we really have to thank a lot of government agencies, or really VR, for providing that support. But the support varies between individuals and between states. So a lot of what's going to happen to a given individual is really going to depend on the quality of services they've received, and really the commitment of whomever is working with them. It's been a long time since I've been a VR client that those things were, profound factors in my life, that I had the good fortune of growing up in Minnesota, where the support was so strong, and where I had a couple of individuals that just really believed in what I was trying to do and provided that support. And lastly, something very important, again, is that typically cases are closed by VR after the individual's been employed for 90 days. There may be some support that remain. That's actually a time in terms of research where there's a data point where a case may be viewed as successfully closed. It's a sort of a key time. And so VR takes people to that first 90 days. God bless them for the help. It's a great thing that they do when they can get people to work. But as we all know, the first 90 days of competitive employment, that's just the beginning. So the majority of research on employment among those with disability has really focused on current employment rates or case closures. So again, a case closure occurs very shortly after the onset of, the individuals either return to work or transition to work. So it's a very early marker of success that isn't really going to capture what happens to people in the long term. The other focus is on current employment rates. So several outcome studies, they may look and just find out if people are employed at the time, and everyone that's employed tends to get lumped together as if all those employment outcomes were equally meaningful, not just in terms of external markers, but to the individuals themselves. So often in studies, there's no differentiation between someone that works 10 hours at a job that may be very low paying and someone who has gone through and as a career and an occupation they've been in for a long time. And I'll talk about alternative outcomes as we go forward. Significant number of studies have used existing data, and so that is a limitation in the research. It certainly is a valuable type of research, not attempting to impugn the work of people that use existing data. It's fundamental to our knowledge of employment outcomes, but it's limited, and it's again typically limited to things like current employment rates or case closures. The NIDRR does support model systems for care, such as the SCI or traumatic brain injury or the burn model systems, and frequently there's data that's used within this system to look at employment with individuals with certain conditions. So again, it's basically a current employment assessment in most cases. And then again, the VR closure data is widely used for outcomes for VR services. So the limitations of existing research. Studies using existing data can become narrow in focus. The emphasis driven more by the availability of the data as opposed to the importance of the scientific question. So when I wrap the presentation up, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dissemination issues and getting people involved with research, people with disabilities involved with research. And, it's clearly a limitation if the data points are already defined. So you're looking and searching through the data points rather than being able to identify those data points that you would like to have within your study. So identification of predictor variables is typically highly limited as well, generally focused on more biographic and disability characteristics rather than person characteristics such as personality, vocational interests, vocational needs, or environmental characteristics. So again, there is a limitation there. The outcome variables often do not adequately quantify important characteristics of employment, such as hours per week, pay rates, and earnings. Now, actually, it might do a little better job with some of those characteristics at times, but there are still significant limitations. And they're really limited in terms of the quality of employment, typically focused on a more narrow range of time. So things like looking at work-life expectancy, job lapses, this entire continuum of time employed, which is very, very important. So our philosophy with the Beyond 90 Days is that employment after disability must be systematically investigated throughout the work life cycle with attention to quality outcomes rather than a focus on current employment status alone or case closures. Not to say that some of that work isn't necessary, it is, but there are other important outcomes, and that's what we focus on. The challenge for those with disabilities, they really begin after the first 90 days in many ways when the services are typically terminated and they return or transition to employment. That really represents only the first step in successful quality employment, in identifying and pursuing career goals. And until research and practice focus on a wider array of outcomes, people with disabling conditions, even when employed, will lag behind the general population in quality of employment, quality of life, and longevity. So, that is a big statement, but it nevertheless is true. So, quality of employment is, again, often underemphasized. So, we see maybe a statistic that will say, what is the portion of individuals that have worked among the varying disabling conditions? So, people will be clustered in some fashion as to the nature of their disability, and there will be an overall employment rate that's very typical research. There may be a rate of case closures, but we know that employment relates to a higher quality of life. So employment with disability is very key. It's key to maintaining health. It's a key to quality of life. And in one of our studies, we found with longevity that people who are employed have completed more education and that make a reasonable income. They are literally, with some levels of severity, their longevity is literally twice that of people that have low education, that are unemployed and therefore living near a poverty level, which people don't talk much about, but disability has really become a poverty issue for a lot of people, and there are way too many people living in poverty. So again, our mission is to systematically use a systematic approach to investigating employment outcomes throughout the work life cycle as a prelude to the development of interventions. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some examples of work we've already completed, and these have all used using data that we have collected in our studies, and each one of these has used some type of two-step statistical model. So when we use two-step statistical models, we look at the predictors of employment status typically, or some measure of employment very globally, as we've talked about, but then look at a second step within that modeling. So, for instance, time from onset until first post-injury job or first post-injury full-time job after spinal cord injury. And so with that, we can quantify in terms of years. Retaining employment after SCI is another example of some work we've done. When you look at job retention, you're looking at everybody that's returned to work, but then you're looking at that current employment status as an indicator of retention, and you can measure that in terms of probability. And then if we look at earnings, we can measure it in terms of dollars. So these methods demonstrate a statistical approach that actually quantifies the likelihood of an outcome in terms of probability or another metric such as years or earnings. So again, we're getting away from simply the dichotomy of working and not working. So in the first study, just to give a brief overview, our purpose was to identify factors associated with the time between the onset of SCI and the first post-injury job. And we used a large participant cohort and rather diverse predictors. We had about 1,500 people. And again, this is primary data collection. This is data we collected for this purpose and some other purposes, but basically it was not utilizing existing data. We found about half the people had been employed at some point, but only 38% had worked full-time. So people were more likely, a lot of people never went back to full-time work. And we also looked at the percentage employed among those, within the first 15 years. We capped it at 15 years. We focused only on those who had been employed at some point. And then we looked at how long it took people to become employed. 71% were employed full-time within the first 5 years, 91% by 10 years post-injury. Again, these are among people that eventually would become employed. Next. And so I have a diagram on here, and it basically shows that return to employment or post-injury employment is a decelerating function. And basically what that means, it goes up very quickly, slows down, and then plateaus. And we can see the plateau at about year 8, 9, or 10, where there's not many more people that are going to be employed if they have not done so by then. One of the things that we're working on now and looking at is we really think that if you look underneath this curve, if you break it down, it's probably a bimodal distribution where you have two very separate processes going on. And one is that people are maintaining their pre-injury job, and that's the blip of people that go back very quickly. And in fact, we have found that the people that go back quickly, they either have a job or they have some other characteristic, high education, that helps them do that. And there's probably a second distribution for people that are transitioning to new employment. So you really have two separate processes, one a job retention process, but the other a transition to work, which is maybe more similar to what we see with younger people with other disabling conditions. So this is just, I've put up a figure of what we call an attributable difference model. And what that is you can look at, you can measure where the metric is attributable differences, how much of an effect is attributable to a given factor. And some of those, again, that are very significant are education, injury severity, and employment characteristics. So in terms of education, and this is to the time to the first job, compared with those who had less than a high school certificate. And again, among those who have returned to work, having a high school or associates or 2-year training, people took a year and a half less to get back to work. People with a bachelor's or graduate degree, 3 years. And again, these are for people that had existing education for the most part. And so it shows an effect of existing education although we know that really post-injury education is more important for people that are transitioning to employment. In terms of injury severity, compared to people that were ambulatory, the least severely injured, people took varying lengths of time to get back to work. And if you look at the table, you can see those that took about 3.7, 3.8 years were those that were cervical injuries that were non-ambulatory, and people that were non-cervical, they tended to take about half that amount of time, 1.7 years. So again, the point just being that there are differences in how quickly people get back to work. And again, those who have the opportunity to go back to the same company or who worked in management have shorter intervals of time. Next. So we also looked at earnings. And so we looked at conditional and unconditional work-related actual earnings. And you probably, the difference between conditional and unconditional earnings is, conditional earnings is when you look just at people who are employed and you're only looking at the differences between people who are employed on a given characteristic, such as age. And so you're only comparing them among those who have gone back to work. And unconditional earnings is when you also account for differences in employment status such that you allocate zero earnings for people who are unemployed. So there are three separate questions. One is, how do the characteristics relate to the likelihood of becoming employed or retaining employment? The second being, among those people who are working or have worked, how does the characteristics relate to differences in what they make? And then lastly, looking at everybody again and allocating zero for those who are not employed. And it's important to do this because you do find that the factors are not necessarily the same that predict employment that would predict, say, conditional earnings. Okay, so looking at just showing the relative frequency of earnings levels. So if we look at that and look at earnings overall, you can see that the majority of people not working, so they're in a very low income, they're in a no income category in terms of their own earnings. And really then people spread out quite diverse. And you see about 10% of the people in our study had 50,000 or more, with 4% of those, or 4% of the total sample, 75,000 or more. This is about 10 years dated. So some people are making a good income, but it's a relatively small percentage. And then if we look at attributable differences, this is simply, the first table I have presented, this is simply the probability of return to work, or of probability of working as it relates to these characteristics. And most everything was significant. There was, the middle age group was not significantly different from the youngest, although the oldest age group was. And so work status at injury was not significant. But the other findings are relatively consistent with what we know from the literature. So for instance, again, more education being associated with a greater likelihood of employment, ambulatory status being associated with a greater probability of employment. So we'll now go to the next slide. And these are the attributable differences. So, so with the earnings, these are related characteristics. So in the second part, so for women, the attributable difference was $11,000. Women made, if they were working, $11,000 less than men. I don't recall exactly how we had the race variable set up, but basically white non-Hispanic individuals were making 12,000 more. So I said it was sexed the opposite way, but it should be men were making 11,000 more, and those with a college degree were making 28,000 more. And some of the things that were important were those things that were not significant. So, for instance, ambulatory status, even though it related to the likelihood of employment, with people who are ambulatory being more likely to return to work, they were not more likely to make more if they were working. So the disability or SCI severity factors were more important to being able to work than they were to earnings if people worked. And the same was true within this study for whether people returned to the same job or to a different job within the same company. So the last example that I will show is one on labor force participation. And our purpose was to identify, again, the sets of factors related to ability to maintain labor force participation. So the first part of the equation in this study was actually the likelihood that people would work at all after an SCI. So labor force participation in this case, the second part of the equation was whether people were currently working among those who had returned or transitioned to work after SCI. Next slide. And I did want to just take note that the types of jobs that people work pre-injury, post-injury were a bit different. So people were more likely to work in management and professional occupations after their injury, less likely to work in service, and less likely to work in natural resources, construction, maintenance, production, transportation, or material moving. And so basically there were changes that clearly were related to the nature of the limitations imposed, that people were more likely to end up in occupations that were consistent with having some significant physical limitations. Next. And so here again, just wanting to show part one, this is the likelihood of transitioning or returning to work after SCI or post-injury employment, as we've called it, post-injury labor force participation. And if you look there again, you see the same traditional types of characteristics and measured again in terms of probability. Next slide, please. And the second part of the model in terms of basically whether they were able to maintain that employment. Men were more likely, whites more likely, those with a bachelor degree more likely, those who are ambulatory more likely, and those who are in management professional or sales and office. So this allows us to focus and see among those people that have gone back. So all these people, even after you account for who becomes employed, you know, who are the people that retain their employment. And by doing this, then we can focus on individuals with the characteristics that place them at risk for job loss, even if they do work post-injury. So again, thinking back to the original model, stage one is much closer to the traditional, has somebody gone back to work. But in this instance, we also need to look at who is able to retain their employment. And the people that are able to retain the employment, you know, that's critical. And if people are not retaining their employment, or if they're making less money, or if it's taking them longer to go back to work, those all can be targets for intervention. Okay, so now I would like to transition. I'm getting a little hoarse here, fortunately, getting close to done. talk about a couple of projects that we have going. And one, again, they're both on successful employment. One is on SCI and one is on MS. So the first program, Successful Employment and Quality Work Life After Severe Disability Due to SCI. And the approach that we are using in these studies is really what we would call a mixed methodology, using both a qualitative study and a quantitative study. And we have historically used quantitative studies in our work. And when quantitative study is, again, you take large data set, either one that's existing or one that represents the responses of your participants, and then we look and do the sort of statistical modeling, the examples that I've just shown. The issue that we find with the quantitative work is sometimes we don't have a good enough sense of all the variables that should be included or where we should put the focus. And if you first do a qualitative study where you bring in people with a particular condition, in this case spinal cord injury, and you bring them together in focus groups, and you vary the focus groups some by the characteristics of people, and then you have a 2 to 3 hour focus group, you can really learn more of the things that may appear to be idiosyncratic or unique that may not be captured by quantitative methodology, or maybe factors you've yet to consider, and you start seeing common patterns among the qualitative responses, and then that allows you to identify themes that then can become part of the quantitative study. So in the two studies that we have going now, the first being the SCI study, we have just completed that study, actually I believe 45 respondents, and we're analyzing that data, getting ready to publish that, and the second part of the study will begin in the next few months, and we're going to get a very large cohort of people with cord injury, 2,500, and we actually have about 4,000 through the history of the studies we've done, so we have access to that number of people. Next. And what we have followed and are following as we are putting together the instrumentation is we've modified a theoretical risk model that we developed for secondary health conditions that's part of the other arm of our work, the longevity after injury arm of the work, and we've revised it for the labor force participation model. And to do this, we have looked and we've clustered factors related to demographics and disabilities, which from the perspective and economics perspective, we would call them control variables or attributable difference variables, and then a whole nother set of variables or predictors of outcomes, which really we call policy variables or policy effects. They're not policies per se, but they are variables that can be more geared toward policy because many of them can be directly addressed through intervention or policy change. And the largest group of that is environmental barriers and supports. So we will be looking at a wide array of environmental characteristics in relation to the outcomes, as well as psychological, behavioral, and health characteristics. So health, things like age and years post-injury, injury severity, those things we have labeled control variables. It's really not a lot of direct control, often any direct control you have over changing those characteristics, although you can target populations with characteristics. But these factors, even general health, job seeking or preparation behaviors, and even psychological factors, to some degree, are those things that can be changed, certainly environmental barriers and supports. And we have clustered outcomes into two broader categories, participation outcomes and what we call quality outcomes. But participation outcomes, so things like employment itself, current employment status that we've talked about that are the most general markers of employment status. Hours per week, time until jobs, job lapses, really has not been studied to the degree necessary. Job mobility, number of jobs people have, other things that can be quantified, total years working, age at departure from the workforce, percentage of time working, and then an overall index of employment participation where you can look at how many 40-hour weeks, for instance, someone has worked in the last year. And then the quality outcomes. We're looking toward developing an overall index that combines both objective and subjective aspects, and the subjective aspect clearly being job satisfaction. How much do people like their jobs, and then objective quality indicators, earnings, job type of pay, promotion, benefits, all those things. Next. So we have a list of measures here and descriptions. I already just talked about them a little bit, but each has its own definition. These will all be things that will be a subset of the outcomes we look at. And as we approach our research, we realize it's very important to catalog the outcomes. So within the design and our proposal, we talked about a lot of predictive factors and getting to really some important predictors. But right now we're working very hard to catalog the full range of outcomes that people have, because that's a lot of what's missing when we look at existing data. And again, the next slide here just shows the types of quality outcomes. Again, earnings, job type of pay, promotions, awards, pay raises, things like that. So the second program of research parallels the first. This is, with this study, we're focusing on MS, but we'll have comparability to the SCI study. So we're using a building block approach. Everything that we can ask that would be common to different disability conditions, measuring outcomes on the same metric. So we'll starting with cord injury, then going to MS, and extending to other groups. So we're doing it in a way where we collect some individualized data that may be needed to capture a diagnosis, but also looking at broader indicators, broader measures that can apply across. And we are doing this as part of the Research and Training Center on Employment After Physical Disability from Virginia Commonwealth. And about 2/3 of individuals with MS still work at diagnosis, but there is a sharp decline. And this is not based on our data, but so these are the sorts of things we're looking at. One concern is once people get labeled as disabled and get benefits, then there's always the concern that they're done. They're just not going to go back. Methodology, same approach. 1,050 participants. We're working with the Shepherd Center, and again, the data analysis will be combined with SCI. And so in future applications, we want to work toward maximizing employment outcomes among those with disabling conditions, rather than simply focusing on the return to employment or transition only. Enhanced prediction of changes in employment outcomes, which will allow for more accurate assessment of lifetime needs, such as done in the life care plan. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the life care planning, but it's very important to be able to predict outcomes in order to identify lifetime needs. We're going to develop equations, models for various outcomes, so not assuming that the predictors of one outcome are going to be the same as the other. So we want cost-effective interventions. Those interventions, given the limited resources, they need to be directed at those things that are most likely to be successful. So if you have, for instance, if the relationship between education and employment were much weaker, then you could not promote educational interventions and expect them to be highly successful. But given that there is such a strong relationship, the magnitude of that relationship draws you to that area. And things like the data that indicate where those lines and where those employment outcomes really change for a given group, hopefully will direct policy. And then we're looking to develop new metrics, such as earnings-based contribution to taxes. Well, what I would love to see is when policymakers go to Congress to say, well, what are the effects of VR, rather than saying we have XX number of people with disabilities working, where every person's head count is the same regardless of severity, regardless of condition, and regardless of the quality of that outcome, that there be other metrics. When someone goes back to work with a disability, and if they go through a career change in a pattern of enhancement, they pay a lot of that tax dollars returns to the economy. They may go into business. They may hire people. Those dollars go back into the economy. But if the only thing that policymakers are looking at are successful case closures or the portion of people currently working, it's not going to capture the effects. And then therefore the intervention programs and the services will be geared toward just getting people in, opening that door to employment, rather than kicking it down. And that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see that door get kicked down and people to be able to go all the way to whatever their capabilities are and not artificially stopped by barriers such as limited earnings or loss of benefits or simply just not being able to get the training they need to maximize their abilities. So I want to conclude by looking at the knowledge translation and dissemination strategies. So what are some of the strategies for including people with disabilities in rehabilitation research? Well, they should be included at all aspects of research. And if you start with things like advisory groups and you go to qualitative research, then your studies will be sensitive to those factors that are deemed most important by people with disabling conditions. How do you maximize research relevance in order to enhance knowledge translation? Well, if you take step one, then your outcomes are going to be of greater relevance. And again, to do this, you have to have the ability to collect original data. So if you get people together and they take you in a direction where there's no data, you need to go collect the data. And so we hope that moving forward, NIDLR does that in terms of supporting those things that will allow us to get the data and include people such that the outcomes are reflective of what people with disabilities feel are important. And then lastly, the strategies for making the findings accessible. Today is a good example, but we need to work harder at that. And we need it to come from both ends. There needs to be the demand side among people with disabilities through the existing educational formats. There already are many journals or magazines that disseminate to people with disabilities, and we need to just place a greater emphasis on getting people the practical information that they can use for self-advocacy. Those were my concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. This is Vicki Brooke. We are right on target, so we're going to give Jim a well-deserved break here, and then we are all going to take a break and get back at 1:05. So I'll see you back at 1:05 sharp. Thank you all. Well, welcome back. Before we went to break, we had a number of questions from our participants for Jim, specifically related to the research that he reviewed. So I'd like to take some of those questions before we turn it over to Dr. Schroeder. Jim, one of the questions from Margaret, who's a participant, was interested in knowing how did you interpret the gender variable? Did it take longer for men or women to acquire their first job after injury?
It actually was not statistically significant, so there really was no significant effect. But the minus, the way that the equation was set up, it was women were the reference group, so the minus number for the men would have been, if it was significant, they would have taken just a little less time on average, but again, it was 0.23 years. It wasn't statistically significant, so I really wouldn't interpret it either way.
Thanks, Jim. We had another question from Danielle. She was asking, how are you collecting the earnings data? Is it self-report data, or are you accessing a database of some sort?
No, all data was self-report. So we did not have an external database.
Okay, so I guess if people had ideas for other ways to collect those data, it would be interesting for all of us. And then there was another question from Gretchen. She was referring specifically to slide 22, which was referencing working at injury, and whether you were referencing men who were injured on the job or if they were employed prior to their injury.
It meant being employed at the time of injury, not a job-related injury, just employment at injury.
All right. Okay, so I think that was all the questions specifically related to the research. Again, I would encourage everyone to, as we're going through the next couple speakers and you're reflecting on Jim's presentation as well, to go ahead and post your questions in the reference chat pad to the left of your screen, and I'll record those and we'll get to those as soon as our speakers have finished with their presentations. So our next speaker is Dr. Frederick Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder is the newly appointed Executive Director of the National Rehabilitation Association, known as NRA. Dr. Schroeder is a nationally recognized expert in the area of disability and employment policy, and has conducted leadership and public policy training for senior-level executives of state, tribal, and private rehabilitation programs. In 1994, the then President Clinton named Dr. Schroeder Commissioner of Rehabilitation Services Administration, RSA, within the U.S. Department of Education. As Commissioner, Dr. Schroeder administered a $2.5 billion program annually, providing training and other employment-related services to more than 1 million people with disabilities throughout the nation. In 1986, Dr. Schroeder was appointed to be the first executive director of the newly created New Mexico Commission for the Blind. When he left in 1994, the commission led the record for placing consumers into jobs with the highest hourly earnings for blind people anywhere in the nation. We are pleased to have you, Dr. Schroeder. I know just talking to you over the last couple weeks, Dr. Schroeder could be anywhere all over the world. So we are happy to have him in one place and able to share with us some of his ideas. Dr. Schroeder?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I found Dr. Krause's research to be really quite thought-provoking, and certainly produce some information that I hope we can get into the day-to-day practice of the vocational rehabilitation program. I think the key thing that I observed is looking at employment as it relates to people with disabilities from the standpoint of quality. It is one thing to say that our mission is to get people into employment, but really I believe firmly that our primary mission is to be part of the civil rights movement of people with disabilities, the movement of people with disabilities toward full integration into society. If we view our purpose or our mission more narrowly, then it becomes a list of services that we provide. But if we view it from the civil rights standpoint, then quality matters. It's not just the job, it's the quality of the job, because the quality of the employment, until it parallels the type of employment that the general population has, then we haven't accomplished really our fundamental job. Dr. Krause talked about not just opening the door, but kicking down the door to employment. And I think that's a really powerful metaphor. So what closes the door? Well, of course, many things close the door. And again, if we look at things functionally, then we tend to tweak our systems and our services. And not to say that that's wrong or bad, but I think it's incomplete. So let me just tell you a quick story. When I was commissioner, I was invited to a ribbon-cutting ceremony in Baltimore. The Rehabilitation Agency in Maryland had just opened a new assistive technology center, a new program. And it was state-of-the-art. It was a fabulous program. And so one of the consumers was asked to speak. He was a young man in his late 20s who broke his neck in a diving accident. Prior to his injury, he had been a middle school science teacher. And he talked about the experience of being first in the critical care facility and then later getting physical rehabilitation and so on. And he said from the very beginning, people talked to him about going back to work. And he said, I didn't know what they were talking about. I was quadriplegic. How could I possibly ever work again? But he said they kept talking about it, and then they started asking him about his plans to go back to work. And he said he had no plans because he just believed that he would never be able to work again. But he said when people ask you about your plans, you have to say something. So he didn't have any plans, but he made them up. And he said over time, with people around him believing that he could work, he began to internalize that belief. And at the time of that ribbon-cutting ceremony, this young man was again teaching science in the very same classroom where he taught prior to his injury. Now, one of the things that struck me about that powerful story was that he never mentioned the Assistive Technology Center. The thing that was powerful to him was the encouragement, the human interaction, the belief in him as an individual. Now, of course, the assistive technology program was absolutely vital to him being able to do the functional aspects of the job. But what was most powerful to him was that encouragement. And I think we see that throughout the data. For example, on one level you can say, well, of course, education leads to higher earnings. It does for the general population, so of course it will with the population of people with disabilities. And that's true. If you have more education, you have more skills, and you're more marketable. But there's another aspect to education, and that is as you go through and earn a degree, be it an undergraduate degree, and perhaps you move on to a graduate degree, you feel differently about yourself as a person with a disability. In other words, you don't go through that long, exhausting process of getting an education unless you believe that education matters and will help you acquire the kind of employment you want at the other end. So I think that as we look at high-quality employment, we have to look at it within that lens of understanding that really our role is to be part of a civil rights movement, that what keeps people out of the workforce is low expectations. Going back to some of the data that Dr. Krause presented that I found really interesting, 2/3 of people with MS were working. Now think about the implications of that. MS is a degenerative condition. So if an employer was reluctant to hire a person with a disability that was constant, that was not changing, wouldn't they logically be even more reluctant to hire somebody with a degenerative condition? Well, logic would tell us yes. So why are 2/3 of people with MS working? Well, I don't know this, but the data caused me to think that there's, at least in my mind, a reasonable probability that it is because those individuals were known as people before the employer knew them as a person with a disability. In other words, the employer knew and valued that employee. And as the employee's condition began to change, the employer already had a valuing of that person's contribution to whatever that enterprise might be. So, and again, I don't know data to support that, but it seems to me very consistent with this idea that we're really fighting a civil rights battle, that yes, we have to equip people with disabilities with the training and the technology and the supports to be able to work, but we also have to help change society's attitudes. Now, going back to the presentation we just heard, the beyond 90 days, the concept of really looking at employment over the lifespan and looking at the quality of that employment. Well, first of all, let me just say, one of the problems we have in rehabilitation is that we are the provider of service and we're the gatekeeper. In other words, we have a defined amount of money. And so there is a balance between providing people with the services they need, but preserving money or being careful enough with money that you can serve the maximum number of people effectively. And there's no science there. A lot of it is judgment. But the 90-day rule is a good, policy is a good example of where I'm going. In 1998, we changed the standard from a 60-day minimum to a 90-day minimum. And the key word here is minimum. The idea is you do not close a case until the employment is stable. And what we were saying is, at a minimum, that should be 90 days. But you're not required to close a case after 90 days. The law says you close the case when you know the employment is stable, that it's truly successful. We looked at actually saying you couldn't close a case until the person was off probation, but then that got very complicated. But trying to get at the point that you really want stable employment for an individual before you close that individual. So why is it standard practice to close people after 90 days? Well, again, I think it's that push and pull between being the advocate for people with disabilities as service providers and being the gatekeeper of the funds. What happens in our measurement systems is agencies get rated on the number of closures. And so one consequence of that is a push to close as many people as you can, but also to close them as quickly as you can. So I think this concept of looking at employment in a much broader sense, looking at employment in terms of the individual's interests and capacity rather than just at a job is very powerful. I want to say one last thing and then I'll see if there are any questions. I think the idea of a civil rights model of disability and our role as rehabilitation professionals as being part of that disability rights movement is reflected in the data that we heard earlier this afternoon that showed what, as far as retention? White men with more education. are more likely to have retain their employment. Well, said the other way, minority men and women with less education are less likely to retain employment. We found this in our longitudinal study. Now, I'm going to talk about two studies, one dealing with race, one not. Our longitudinal study showed that 1 year after case closure, we had 85% job retention rate, which is very good. And 2 years out, we still had, or 3 years out rather, we still had an 80% job retention rate, still very good. But the 20% who fell out of employment, guess what kind of employment it was? It was the low-skilled, low-wage employment. And so if people are stratified by race and gender into lower-skilled, lower-wage jobs, not only do they suffer economically in terms of low earnings, but they're more likely to lose those or to turn over in those positions, not to be able to sustain themselves and their families. So the other study I want to just quickly mention, when I got to RSA in 1994, we had just completed a study to see whether there was a racial bias in the types of services and outcomes for people with disabilities served by the system. And the researchers said that there was not a racial bias. And I'm not quarreling with them, but I'm just using this as an example. Their methodology said if you look at minority people and you look at their prior work experience and their education level, and you compare that to non-minority people with the same or similar work experience and similar education level, there was no outcome, there was no difference in outcomes. So you can look at that and say, therefore, there was no discrimination. And in one sense, you would be right. But again, if our job is to help people get employment consistent with their ability, then we have to recognize that minority people disproportionately have lower work experience and lower education levels, not because they're lazy or have no drive or capacity, but because the opportunities have been less for them. And so, in my mind, it's not just taking a person and placing that person based on the minimal transferable skills that he or she has, but if we really view our role in the way that was just described in our previous presentation as looking at employment across the lifespan, kicking down that door that bars people with disabilities from fulfilling employment, and looking at employment that is not only sustainable, but truly consistent with the individual's capacity, then I think that changes the way we structure our services. So if there are questions or comments, I'd be happy to address them.
Dr. Schroeder, we have a couple questions here, but first, Jim Krause sent a kind of clarifying statement, and Jim, you're welcome to chime in here. He was referring to your response to the MS multiple sclerosis rate is at diagnosis, but it goes down to 20% to 30% by year 15, identifying that disclosure is a huge issue with regard to that to those data. Jim, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, and this is really, we're just learning about MS, our group, and working with some outstanding people like Phil Rumrill up at Kent State. And so this was not based on our research, but the issue with MS and where it fits maybe into the presentation, some of what I talked about earlier is SCI, whereas SCI seems to have both, there's a job retention element for some people, but their situation is always clear to people on the outside. So like the example just brought up by Dr. Schroeder of the individual who was a science teacher, everybody knew he had the injury. And so, employers, it's sort of a rallying point. And so early on after an injury, that's the time where I believe you can garner the support. There's a window of opportunity for some people to go back to that job, a job retention type model. Once it's gone, then they go into more of a protracted job acquisition or transition to employment where they are maybe training, other elements required. But with MS, there's very much of everything that we've learned from really others' work. With MS, it's a very different situation because the disability is not apparent to others, and so there is a very big concern over whether to disclose that or not. And once people with MS, and again I'm going by others' research and what our experts like Phil have told us, that the things we are starting to look at, but it's really a job retention model. Once someone gets out of the workforce, on benefits, identified as having a disability, they're very unlikely to go back. And so just to clarify that, that the basis of what I had put up there. So it's something we're learning about, but the disclosure is just a huge issue.
Thanks, Jim.
Very helpful, and you know, it leads me to wonder, and I don't know if people have researched this, but I suspect that people who acquire disability gradually, be it MS or someone who loses vision gradually, at least in my own experience, I can tell you that as I lost vision over a 9-year period of time, I limited myself. In other words, as I could see less, I just assumed I could do less. And so it'd be interesting to see whether what kinds of interventions, be it peer support, be it specific kinds of techniques or training, but I suspect that that is a characteristic shared by people who have progressive disabilities. Anyway, on to the questions.
Okay, thanks, Fred. I think, Jim, did you have a clarifying question, too, about race and education?
Well, I thought, again, the observation that was just made was really excellent about when some people from underserved populations being maybe at the time of disability, having less education, coming from less experience. What we've found in our research is that when you look at the relationship between education and employment after spinal cord injury, at least for non-Hispanic blacks, the outcomes don't match the education level in the same way they do for white non-Hispanic and smaller group of Hispanic participants, but the pattern between whites and Hispanics seems similar in terms of, a lot of added benefit in terms of the number of years of education. And that pattern didn't just hold us for non-Hispanic blacks. And so one of the things that I would just say is part of the question is, and again, really fits with what was just raised by Fred and outstanding points, and that is, you can't simply just add up the years of education or assume that all education of a certain degree is of the same quality, or that individuals are otherwise prepared to benefit equally. We need to learn more about those disparities and why maybe we're not seeing quite as strong of a relationship. The whole area of disparities in health and employment outcomes it really is very important within the area of disability. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Jim. I see I have a question from Susan, but I'm going to wait for, that'll be the first question I'll use during the Q&A, Susan, but I want to return to the program. And our next speaker will be Dr. Catherine Inge. Dr. Inge has over 30 years of experience providing training and technical assistance, including developing and disseminating best practice information on employment for those who have been unemployed and underemployed due to a significant disability. Dr. Inge has worked at VCU since 1982 on federally funded projects through research and training efforts, including the early demonstrations on employment for individuals with disabilities. Currently, Kathy Inge is the director of Virginia Commonwealth University's Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employment for People with Physical Disabilities. She is also the project coordinator for VCU's subcontract with CEDL, the Center on Knowledge Translation and Employment Research, our partners in this State of the Science Conference today. Both of these projects are funded through NIDR. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy. Good afternoon, and I am really pleased to be able to present some of the preliminary information that we have on a study that the KTER Center is doing. And while this study has only been going on approximately 6 weeks, the foundation for this research really has been laid through the entire time that CEDL and VCU have been working together on this particular project. And although I have on your slide here that the research team for this particular study is myself, Jay McLaughlin, and Carolyn Graham here at VCU, it really is a group effort by the entire project team. And really the foundation for this study was laid when we first did our initial work for the Knowledge Translation Center, and we did a systematic review, and in our systematic review it was on employment for individuals with traumatic brain injury, and really the practice that came up as showing that it was evidence-based was supported employment for individuals with traumatic brain injury. So that was our first step to designing this study. Then we moved into the second process, which was actually conducting focus groups with individuals with disabilities, and that included individuals with traumatic brain injury. And what the intent of those focus groups was to determine what individuals with disabilities know about evidence-based research and how they access research information. And so the next period of time where we worked together, we conducted those focus groups, and the results of those focus groups pretty much revealed that individuals with disabilities tend to like to source information from trusted experts, such as perhaps their VR counselor, a career advisor, physicians, or other people that they are familiar with, as well as knowledgeable individuals with disabilities. And they said that they also were increasing the use of the internet for obtaining this information about employment using websites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And so once we looked at all of this research that we conducted initially, we pretty much together decided that we had 2 questions, research questions, that we wanted to test when we looked at identifying a knowledge translation strategy for really getting research about evidence-based practice out to our target audience of individuals with disabilities. And those 2 research questions appear on your screen at this particular point. Specifically, we decided that we would determine if Facebook could be used with to increase the knowledge and use of evidence-based research on specifically supported employment by individuals with traumatic brain injury, with that Facebook group being led by a peer mentor. And you will notice there that I have secret Facebook group in my research question. I'll explain a little more about a secret Facebook group in a few minutes. And our other question really is looking at what the relationship is between participant demographics and the effectiveness of the KT strategy that we are testing. And so those are our 2 specific research questions. As I said a few minutes ago, the study really has only been going on for 6 weeks, so let me just give you a little bit of overview of how this particular study it has been designed. It is a random control study, and we recruited participants in the clubhouses of Virginia that serve individuals with traumatic brain injury to participate, and we did that in 2 ways. We sent out emails to the constituents of those clubhouses, as well as attending clubhouse meetings to recruit people and explain the intent of this particular study. We also sent out a notice on a listserv for individuals with traumatic brain injury describing the study and seeking participants. In all total, we had a response rate of 121 individuals with traumatic brain injury who consented to participate in our study. From that point, we went to working with that 121 individuals to complete our pre-test questionnaire, and we had 6 emails returned that as undeliverable, and a couple of people requested to be removed from the study. So we basically ended up with 113 individuals with traumatic brain injury that we worked with to complete the pre-test. Unfortunately, this is probably something that we'll want to think about later in doing further research. Of that 113, over a month period of time of encouraging them to complete the pretest, we ended up with 68 individuals who had actually completed the pretest so that we could move forward with the study. So all of our individuals in the study have a traumatic brain injury. They're between the ages of 18 and 65, and were unemployed at the time of the initiation of the study. So that's just a brief overview of the sample population. Our intervention is that we randomly assigned our 68 individuals into 2 groups. One group of 34 is receiving our Facebook intervention, and the second group of 34 are receiving basically an e-news listserv dissemination of information that mirrors the information that's being provided on Facebook. As I've already said, we have done a pre-test. We will do a post-test. We'll also be doing an analysis of the qualitative information, which there is going to be a wealth of information that we'll actually have on Facebook that we could analyze. As I mentioned previously, part of the research that we did with the focus groups told us that individuals with disabilities like to receive information from a trusted, more knowledgeable individual with disabilities. And that person that we identified to help us with this study is Jay McLaughlin. And I've actually known Jay since I believe it was 1988, 1989, when Jay was actually one of the first individuals in a project that we had here on supported employment for individuals with traumatic brain injury. So I've really watched Jay really progress during that time period. And Jay did not have a college degree prior to his traumatic brain injury. He was injured, I believe, at age 26 and came here and was a supported employment consumer and got his first job through a project here. And then he went back and eventually earned his master's degree in rehab counseling. And now he is in a private rehab counselor, and he provides services to individuals in the disability community. Jay is just outstanding, and I couldn't say enough wonderful things about him. Jay and I are leading the Facebook group, and the way the intervention is working is that there is a minimum of 1 post per day by Jay. And the way that it has kind of evolved is that he is doing those in the evenings and posing inspirational thoughts as well as information about employment. During the day, I pretty much watch the group and respond to participants' unless Jay has already responded to them about questions that they have. So although the intervention says that we're only going to post something at least once a day, we're seeing interactions throughout the day that's being monitored by both Jay and myself. I just have a couple more minutes, and so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time about the secret Facebook group details, but I think it's really important for anybody considering this as an intervention to know that that is the technical term that Facebook uses for this, and it very much protects the privacy of the end user. And we did have questions from people initially about whether their information would be disclosed to anyone else. But essentially with a secret Facebook group, it's really the highest privacy setting allowed. No one else that is not a friend of the person that is a member of the Facebook group can see any of the postings. And if you were to search for our group on Facebook this afternoon, you would not be able to find it. And there's a lot of detailed information I'd be happy to share with anyone about that, since I had to delve into that when we set up this particular group. Really, I don't have but a couple more minutes, and there's just probably lots and lots of wealth of information to be shared about this, and I know that we're going to have some really exciting findings. I'm going to close with one of the questions from the pre-test about how often do you use Facebook to find information on services or supports on employment for individuals with traumatic brain injury. 62% of our sample said that they never use Facebook to find information on employment. 15% said that they use Facebook once or twice a month to find information on employment. 14% said 3 to 4 times a day. Now, this specifically is a question related to employment, and 9% that they used it daily or more often. So really, 62% of the sample said that they never used Facebook for finding information on employment. But when we asked them conversely how often did they go online and view or use Facebook, 82% indicated that they used Facebook at least once or more times daily. So what we're looking at there as far as information, again, this is just very preliminary information, that this group of individuals, of 64 individuals, 82% of them do use Facebook, but they really have never used it for gaining information on employment. So really, certainly what we're hoping to demonstrate is that the use of social media is an effective strategy for disseminating evidence-based practices to individuals with disabilities. And I could probably talk about this for another hour because I'm really excited about this project. So anybody that is on the line that would like to talk with me, I would encourage you to give me a call or an email. Thank you very much, Kathy. That's really, it's exciting research. It's very innovative. If I could just, we're open now for Q&A, and I want to go back to Susan's question. Susan posted during Dr. Schroeder, your presentation, she wanted to know, did you have any suggestions for sort of, for somebody who has who identifies a disability during childhood versus somebody with a more progressive disability, of how to kind of level that playing field?
Oh, what a complicated question. I do think that age of onset of disability is certainly has a number of consequences, and at one level, if a person acquires a disability as a child, logically you would think the person grows up with it being a natural part of himself or herself, and in terms of using compensatory techniques, it's like any other skill that you learn. If you learn it young, perhaps you'll be better at using those compensatory techniques or whatever adaptations or accommodations you may use. But I also think that there is a difference in the sense that you don't necessarily, as a child, develop a rounded view of disability even though you have a disability. Going back to my analogy of disability as a minority issue or a civil rights issue, if you're a minority individual, your parents, your siblings, your aunts and uncles share that ethnicity unless you're adopted. And very often, I think children with disabilities do not have those peers that they can interact with, nor access to adult role models. So getting to the specifics, though, I think for either population, I think peer mentoring or peer support, identifying oneself as part of the community of people with disabilities, not in an isolating, segregating way, but in terms of an identity, I think that is key or I should say is the foundation really for helping unlock the individual's potential.
Jim, did you have anything to add to that?
No, other than I certainly agree that it's just very complex. I do believe within people that are injured traumatically, that the earlier in life tends to favor better employment outcomes quite considerably. So all things equal with something of an injury like a spinal cord injury, I don't know about other groups. That's not been the focus of our research as of yet. But definitely within an injury group, at least within cord injury, there's an advantage to having the injury in adolescence or very early adulthood.
Okay. We had another question that was posted by a participant at registration. And the question is, how does health and function impact employment, as well as how does employment impact health and function of individuals with disabilities? I guess we'll start with you, Jim.
Well, I don't have any incredible insights other than clearly those things are related. There's no question that when we've looked in our study that if you have people with severe health complications like pressure ulcers and such, and they're unemployed at one time and you move forward longitudinally, their chances of becoming employed when they've had a lot of additional or secondary conditions are really, obviously limiting. And so healthier people are going to be more likely those that can become employed. But I don't think there's any question also that that employment itself promotes health. It promotes when you're employed, you have to be at certain places at certain times. You may get some flexibility in your job, but it provides structure. You have to have a certain level of health to do it. Clearly it's related to longevity, although at the same time I would say there are instances where, if you're employed and then you have health problems, sometimes you have to face a decision as to whether if you have important things at work, you have the beginnings of a pressure sore, and you have to weigh that. It's very difficult. So I don't think it's simple. I don't think the relationship is simple, but unquestionably, each affects each other. Each aspect affects each other.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This question was also posted by a participant at the time of registration. And I think this individual is asking the same question, but doing it two ways. And maybe, Fred, if you could respond initially. How can we help stakeholders who need this information to understand its importance to their daily work lives? And in other words, how do we help people without disabilities, be they employers, business owners, family members, to understand why they need to be aware of the disparities in employment opportunities and how and why they need to be part of the solution?
Well, again, another really complex question. Let me start with
let
me start with the second piece.
Okay.
I don't know that the average person on the street, if you were to say to them, the unemployment rate of people with significant disabilities is 70%, I don't know that many people would be startled by that because they think, well, of course, if somebody has a very severe disability, no wonder they're unemployed. They can't work. So I think, I don't know that it's the data so much that we need to get to the employer community and to society generally, as much as a shift in looking at people with disabilities as having the same combination of skills and abilities as others within the, of course, within the context of certain functional limitations, but learning to look at people in terms of what they're able to contribute to a business or enterprise, and not simply viewing the individual as a broken person or a damaged person, or to put it bluntly, an inferior person. And I think this goes back to, again, why I like this concept of saying, let's not just look at employment, but let's look at quality of employment. Because, and I hope this isn't offensive, but frankly, if you put somebody with a significant disability into a low-skilled, low-wage job, that doesn't change society's attitudes. It reinforces the segregation that there are these few little kind of inconsequential jobs that those people can do. And I think as we get people into more challenging employment consistent with their interests and abilities, then it is that exposure to people with disabilities who are actually contributing to a business or enterprise that I think will shape attitudes. The first half of that question now has escaped me, but those are my thoughts on the attitudinal piece.
Hi, this is KTER. Fred, what you just said really stimulated a thought as far as something that I've been seeing in the Facebook group from the participants, and you used the term broken individuals, and a theme that has been reoccurring in the Facebook group from the participants has been around this concept of, now that I have a disability, I think the word broken is as good a term as any, and really the attitude that, well, what contribution do I now have to contribute to work? And that's not that that's a surprising theme that has arisen, but that really instilling in people that they bring value to business and that they have a significant contribution to make, I think is really a really critical thing that we need to attend to as well.
I would also like to add more, and I agree with the points being made really strongly, but what I feel has happened is that we've taken sort of an advocacy approach, and we've taken, well, it's the right thing to do to hire people with disabilities, and taken that approach of, you're doing a nice thing, you're helping people out. Even the, hire for ability, not disability, I think there's still an underlying message, and what it really, I believe, will come down to is just like diversity elsewhere. I heard a presentation once of someone that came to the university talking about diversity, and basically he said, compare diversity of people with an economic profile, and that there is benefit to being diverse, and it's good for business. And so, the message that we need to get across is to businesses is that there's something that they're missing out on if they close their job market to people with skills that could help them. And there are a lot of people with disabling conditions in this country. And if you hire people with conditions, if you hire people of whatever demographic, it tends to bring additional business in. So I live in Charleston, and it just sort of is mind-boggling to me to go and see businesses that have gone under, that have been grandfathered in on accessibility and have a 4-inch step that keeps people out of the door. and that they probably felt lucky that they were grandfathered in, and or because of the historic area that they didn't have to make those changes. But until people step back and see the benefits of that, the companies see the benefits, I don't think those things are going to change. And I fully agree, just putting people in at the lowest paid jobs and the lowest skilled jobs is only going to continue to reinforce the stereotype. Now, some people, where they start, need to be in those jobs. Actually think any work is good work, but it has to be a starting point, not a finishing point.
Thank you, Jim. We have a question posted by Dan, and Jim, this is to you about related to your spinal cord injury research. Are you looking at future research into supporting individuals with SDI who require personal care assistance, and what policies need to be in place in order to allow them to maintain their access to long-term support services that cover the cost of personal assistance services in order to maintain their employment? And then, Dr. Schroeder, you might want to follow up on Jim.
We're looking at it in general. We are looking at barriers, disincentives to employment, and one of the things again that we hope to address within our research is how limiting it is to have a cap of money where people, if they go over that cap, that it just becomes a simple issue of mathematics to know that they cannot work more. So what our hopes are through the demonstration of what people can do, and that some of those barriers will change, specifically some of the disincentives. And actually one thing that would be different, a little different with our approach, even though we're talking about successful employment throughout the career and maximizing, a part of sort of the logistics of our approach is that, again, no employment is bad. So if someone has to balance, and they have, as long as the disincentives and those are there, that we'd like to see how many people juggle that, work a certain level below those benefits, and that might not be a great outcome for the federal government, but I think it's a great outcome for the individual, at least a good outcome, until some of those barriers come down.
Thanks, Jim. Dr. Schroeder, do you want to comment on personal assistance services?
Yeah, just very quickly, I would say that we know there are huge disincentives to work, and frankly, I think it comes from the policy driving so many of the rules and regulations that hem people in. And for example, only 0.5% of people leave the Social Security disability rolls each year. 0.5%. And Social Security, for as long as I know, has been trying to find ways to incentivize people to leave the rolls. And not to be unkind about it, but it's because there's a sense that this is a huge burden on the taxpayer, and so it's not driven by quality of life concern for the individual with a disability as much as it's driven by the concern that we just simply need to reduce disability benefit costs. And so if you change that mindset, a person who needs personal assistance services, why would you limit that? Why wouldn't you provide that to the extent that is needed and for the duration that it's needed for the individual? In other words, if we view disability as a cost that should be borne by the individual, then we end up with our current policies. If we see disability as a cost that should be shared across society in the same way we share costs for health care and education and police and fire and on, then you come up with a very different paradigm that says we want everybody to have the opportunity to be productive and that the costs will vary. So the cookie cutter invariably leads to people not being able financially to work when they are wanting to work and capable of work. So but I think it's the underlying policy that drives then the systems. And as you can tell, I think it really needs to be person-centered, not system-centered.
This is Kathy. We're doing focus groups right now on the ROTC on employment for people with physical disabilities, and this is a recurring theme that's coming up in the focus groups. We're talking with people with spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, and other physical disabilities. And we don't have the analysis of the focus group data yet, but we were talking about it the other day. It's very much a recurring theme that people with physical disabilities, specifically that we're looking at, are saying that they are having to limit the number of hours that they're working because they'll lose their benefits that pay for their personal assistance services. Recurs over and over again. In fact, in a group that I just did last week, one woman who actually is at a I don't remember what her particular job was, specifically said that she had to work only a specific number of hours so that she wouldn't lose her personal assistance services. So it's obviously very much a critical issue that needs to be addressed.
And let me add one last comment, and I agree again both with everything that's been said, but there again, it sort of comes to us as researchers to find a different metric for the government to look at. And one of the different metrics actually relates to the earlier comment about the chicken and egg sort of comment about employment and health. Well, we know that if you take people, and maybe we haven't demonstrated it well enough, that if we take people that are unemployed and they become employed, they're going to stay healthier. They're going to have fewer costs. So the cost of attendant care relative to the cost of providing acute hospitalization treatment, surgeries for secondary health complications is really relatively small. And we have to find ways, again, of getting policymakers to look at the metric more broadly than simply, oh, you're on this, we're going to draw the line right here, we're not going to pay any more expenses, when they're already having to pay that. So they're going to pay it either way. So if the person's not working or working less than the hours, so why not just pay it? Give people their care. It's going to create a better economic outcome in the long term for the government. But it's hard to produce that change.
Speaking of change, there was another participant question that was posted at time of registration. And this individual wants to know if you could share examples of where agencies have changed their practice and or policies based upon new knowledge that has positively impacted stakeholders. You got anything for us, Fred?
I didn't quite follow the question. Could you read it one more time?
Sure. Do you have specific examples where agencies have changed their practices or policies based upon new knowledge that have had a positive impact on people with disabilities?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that if I'm understanding the question correctly, some agencies are much more proactive at looking at best practices, looking at emerging practices, looking at research data, and feeding that into their programs. But I don't know that it's consistent. And I think going back to Dr. Krause's presentation earlier, the way you approach this is by involving stakeholders at the very beginnings. The stakeholders community can tell you what they see as their primary need, what policies they see as supporting the employment and full integration of people with disabilities. And so I think the way to benefit the stakeholder community isn't to do something to them or for them, but to partner.
Okay. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're going to, although I see somebody typing here, I think we're going to wrap up for today. This has been a really great discussion. I just so appreciate Dr. Krause for all your time, Dr. Schroeder for just actually getting you within the country that we could talk to you, and KTER for all of your presentations and your comment and content for today. I think Dr. Krause has really challenged us all to view successful employment from a different lens. And his ideas about until research and practices focus on a wider array of outcomes, people with disabilities, even those individuals who become employed, are going to lag behind the general population, both in quality of employment, the quantity of, the quality of their life, and as well as longevity. I heard some very specific marching orders from all of our presenters about how to really maximize employment outcomes, not just return to work or transition only, but really looking at quality employment outcomes. I think today's comment about, I think that was from you, Dr. Schroeder, about when we assist people who are really underemployed, it just reinforces those stereotypes. So really helping people to get really quality employment. I think we're all going to now have to go out, and if we don't know what Life Care Plan is, that Jim has sort of challenged us to kind of look at that model as having a better way to enhance prediction of change in employment outcomes. Dr. Schroeder's reminder to all of us that the 90-day closure that kind of is gospel in our field is really just a minimum. It was never meant to be a maximum, and it's really about employment stability. And Katty's ideas for just a novel way to maybe use social media as a way to meet stakeholders where they're getting information. I mean, I think that has a tremendous amount of promise. I'm excited to see how that research bears out. I know that she is having a lot of fun doing that research along with Jay. And the message for all of us, that including stakeholders at all levels, will help ensure that the data is relevant. It may help us to down a path where we collect more original data. And in terms of just making our outcomes and strategies for marketing research findings more accessible, I agree that today's presentations using this technology is a beginning, and we all kind of need to double down on those efforts. So I wanted to thank everybody for their participation and their questions. This has been a great session, and we are on break from now until 2:50 when we will return with the employer session.